So anxiety, so we're going to explore here how anxiety has become a habit for many of us and how mindfulness can help us break the anxiety habit loop. So I'm calling it a kind of a loop, and I'll explain what I mean by that. Um, so anxiety, you could say, is fueled by fear plus uncertainty, right? So anxiety arises when the prefrontal cortex, the more recently evolved part of our brain, it does not have enough information to accurately predict the future. So it's searching for can search for this information. In fact, it can lead to panic if the brain, the prefrontal cortex, can't find the information and anxiety starts to deepen. The prefrontal cortex can actually go offline due to as panic arises. And I'll talk more about that in week 4. So fear is necessary, right? It's natural. It's necessary. It's part of. It evolved in us as a survival instinct. It developed to help ensure our survival, right? We wouldn't be here without the fear response. It's developed evolutionarily as we got chased by saber-toothed tigers. It was the fear response. So fear helps us avoid dangerous situations. And so that's, I mean, it's natural, it's necessary. So it's not something we can actually stop from happening, nor would we really want to. It's useful, still useful today. For example, if you may not be getting chased by saber-toothed tigers, but if you step out onto the road in front of a car that's speeding down the road, the fear is very useful. It's going to kick in a response where you instinctively jump back out of the way, right? If you relied on your prefrontal cortex to analyze the situation and calculate the velocity, all the dimensions of the situation, you'd get run over before you reacted quick enough. So fear gives you that immediate, instinctive, you could say, response. So fear by itself doesn't cause anxiety. And, you hear a lot of talks out there where they're talking about overcoming your fear and this kind of thing. Really, it's more about looking at how we create anxiety. Fear is useful. Anxiety is not useful. But for the most part, anxiety has become a habit for most of us. It's really become a habit. So we've developed this. I've mentioned the prefrontal cortex. I'll just go into a little bit of this, 30 seconds. Bear with me on this part. There's a prefrontal cortex. It's a layer that's on top of the more primitive or brain, the survival brain. It's sometimes called. So this prefrontal cortex helps us plan for the future. It does the thinking and creativity. And it tries to predict what's going to happen in the future by looking at what's happened based on past experiences and running simulations, you could say, about what might happen in the future. So it's always looking for information in order to make as accurate a prediction as it can about what might happen in the future. And this is where anxiety comes in. So anxiety is kind of based on worry, unease about something that has an uncertain outcome, an event in the future with an uncertain outcome. It comes when our prefrontal cortex doesn't have enough information to accurately predict the future. And we see this right now with the coronavirus. Without enough information, our brains can spin stories of fear, worry, and it almost endlessly search for additional information. And as I said before, when anxiety becomes overwhelming, it can lead to panic when anxiety deepens. And panic is just this uncontrollable anxiety that causes the thinking brain to go offline, to be literally shut down. When we're overwhelmed by anxiety, the future, our prefrontal cortex goes offline. So when this happens, of course, we're less equipped to deal with whatever might be arising. So the key part of panic is to bring the prefrontal cortex back online, and that's what we'll be looking at in week 4, and how to do that skillfully using different mindfulness and meditation techniques. So what I really want to dive into today is how we get to know these anxiety loops. And that's why the meditation that we did was so focused so much on the present moment, and why meditation really helps us do this work, because in meditation we're practicing being in the present moment, right? I mean, we've discussed the research here, how 50% of the time we're not in the present moment, we're thinking about the future or the past, right? The study where people entered in on their phones what they were thinking about while they were doing something, and I think it's like 47% of the time we're present with what we're doing, and the rest of the time our minds are elsewhere. So that the ability to be present for what's arising allows us to see our life unfolding, to see what's happening right now in the present moment. Not waiting until, anxiety, a full-blown anxiety or even panic arises. We're seeing things as they're unfolding much earlier on. And this allows us to interrupt the anxiety loop, right? By being present for it in this way. So to interrupt the cycle of anxiety, we're going to go through these 3 steps. And today we're going to talk more about the first step, and then at the end you actually have to get a homework assignment or a home practice. You get a worksheet and a practice to help you uncover your anxiety loops. So the first step is becoming aware, uncovering, mapping out, you could say, your anxiety habits or anxiety habit loops. So really mapping those out. And I'll talk a lot more about what that means. The second step is you look at and know the result of this anxiety pattern loop. You start to see what happens as a result of it. What happens next. And the third is making what psychologists call a bigger and better offer. This comes from behavioral psychology, by replacing a stressful reward, which is part of the anxiety loop, with a more positive and healthy reward. And I don't know if you read, the psychology literature that's around right now, but behavioral science and psychology, it's making a comeback. It's like the 1970s for me all over again, with obviously more knowledge involved, but we've kind of gone from cognitive therapies back to behavioral. But what's interesting is how mindfulness can be folded into this, because the Buddha talked about seeing how we create suffering for ourselves in the second noble truth, right? Through this cycle of craving and clinging, and how that there's a path out of this once we see how we're creating it. So we can see firsthand what the suffering, the dukkha, feels like. And we can also, when we're aware, see when we let go of craving and clinging, what that feels like. So in a way, you're behaviorally showing yourself that non-suffering is preferable to suffering, and that would change your behavior so that you're more apt to be present for your experience. So there's these really cool similarities that I kind of noticed as I was working with some of the behavioral science stuff. So first off, we map our anxiety habit loops. That's what we want to, the first step. And we don't want to sort of skip over this and think, I know what those are. It's very important that we pay attention throughout our days and really look and map out what are kind of top anxiety loops in our lives that cause us problems. I did this for the last week, and I'll share a couple of them with you. Worrying about the future is a common anxiety habit loop. Smoking, drinking, eating are other common ones, and they're often ways to deal with anxiety that's arising or some kind of stress or unease. But those are also, we can also map out those kinds of habit loops as they relate to anxiety. So I'll give you some examples of those 3 steps playing out just to make it a little clearer. So example 1 is fear of catching COVID comes up. Right? Fear of catching COVID. So our habit pattern might be to pick up our device and do a Google search and begin reading the kind of tidal wave of information that's out there. Much of it contradictory. It can become confusing, and this makes us feel worse. And it could get so bad that panic could actually arise for us, in which case the prefrontal cortex goes offline, and we have no ability in that case to deal with the situation. And we can't suppress this or think our way out of it. So what do? So with this practice, we can map out the habit loop that's taking place. And we might notice what the brain is doing here. So we could notice, and we could put down our device, because we know that this is a loop that creates anxiety, and carry on. So pause in this case could become our new habit. And when we pause, new options might emerge. And of course, if panic had set in, the pause will allow the prefrontal cortex to come back online. And perhaps we call a friend who's a virologist that we know and ask some questions from somebody like that, and perhaps find an information source from that person that we could go to in the future. And we notice how this makes us feel when we relate to it in this way. Perhaps we notice, instead of anxiety, we notice calm, we feel calm, and we can really sense into that calm. So that's the new loop, in a sense. When we experience calm rather than anxiety, our brains are going to move towards that bigger and better offer. Right? Our brains are going to naturally want to feel, freedom or calm instead of dukkha and anxiety. Another example, you wake up in the middle of the night, or perhaps just lying down to go to sleep. It works either way. And you start worrying about a situation of some kind, a situation at work or a relationship, some situation that's there. You start worrying about it. So our habit loop might be to lay in bed thinking about a way to fix it, perhaps blaming events on particular people. So we see how, and then that causes more anxiety, causes us not to be able to go to sleep. And that's a identifiable habit loop that we can actually map out. With this, once we see that habit loop, we can again we can see it, make a bigger and better offer. We can see what our brain is doing, and we can decide to do something else. Perhaps we have some techniques that can help us ground ourselves, belly breathing, or other techniques ways that we can relate to these kinds of spinning thoughts. So once again, we've experienced calm rather than anxiety, and our brains will move towards that that bigger and better offer.